last week we talked about Ephesians 5:28, which says, "In the same way, husbands, love your wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself." And this week we're going to continue that with verses 29 and 30, which say, "For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body." So what then does it mean not to hate our wives in the way that we treat them, but to nourish and cherish them?
Great. Let's get into that. Before we jump into today's episode, we just wanted to share a few things with you. First, we'd like you to like this episode and then subscribe to our podcast. If you're doing that on YouTube, also hit the bell notification so that you know when we post anything new. And then share this with somebody that you feel like this would be beneficial for.
That's right. If you would like to support our show further, we would welcome that. You are welcome to do that at anchor.fm/marriagebydesign to check out your options for supporting the program financially. Otherwise, guys, the links to our social media are always in the description of every video, so feel free to check those out there. And now, let's get to the show.
Hi, I'm Andrea Warnock.
I'm Nathan Warnock.
And you've joined us for Marriage Monday on the Marriage by Design podcast. And this is a time where we get to talk to you about God's design for marriage, what the Bible has to say about marriage, and then how we live that out practically.
That's right. So we're going to talk today in our kind of continued discussion, kind of Bible study look at some passages of Scripture that talk about marriage. And we're going to continue our discussion of Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus that you can find in the book of Ephesians in the Bible, starting in chapter 5. And we've been taking the back half of chapter 5, which is really a kind of deep dive look at what the concept of marriage was designed to be, and really is one of the primary scriptures upon which this channel is based from the beginning. So what we're going to talk about today is Ephesians 5 verses 29 and 30, which say, "For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body." We've been talking about this kind of second challenge that Paul gives to husbands. The first one being to love our wives as Christ loved the church. And then the second one being, husbands, love your wives as you love your own bodies. And we talked about this starting last week, so I'd love to have you check that out. I'll link to it here. But also take that even a step further, because it's not enough for Paul to just say, husbands, love your wives as your own body. But he's also saying that, defining that further, well, here's what that looks like. And I find it interesting that he starts 29 by saying, making an intuitive argument, which is no one ever hated his own flesh, right? Meaning that it is commonsensical for us as human beings to understand that we take care of ourselves. Right now, certainly we can argue about what that looks like, and different people have different opinions on what that looks like, right? I mean, there are certainly people that believe that, well, if you're taking care of your body, then you're being healthy, then you're, doing all these things. Well, there's a sense in which what he's saying here is that we all feed into what our body wants or needs. Mm-hmm. And so I do find it fascinating here that he starts not by just saying, for no one ever treated their body poorly. Mm-hmm. Right? He says, for no one ever hated his own flesh. Yeah. But nourishes and cherishes it. So he's juxtaposing these two ideas of, we don't hate our bodies, but we nourish and cherish it. These are opposite ideas. And so
the idea that if you're not nourishing it, you're hating it.
Yeah, it seems to be this sort of juxtaposition that he's making, where he's saying, hey, if you're nourishing and cherishing for something, then you don't hate it, right? But if you hate something, then you're not nourishing and cherishing it. And I find it this really interesting idea. And This is an idea that we find elsewhere in Scripture too, but we think of hatred as angry and
Betrayal.
and violent, right? If we think about things that we think are hatred, we think of like violence and these kinds of things, but that's not necessarily a biblical definition of hatred, right? One thing that the Bible teaches that is equivalent or is opposite to love, which we might consider hate, is apathy, right? Just not caring enough to love. Which is really interesting. It's almost this idea of, well, if you don't care enough about something to choose to love it, even when you don't feel like loving it, that's hatred. Like, there's a significant piece of love that is choice. It is a volitional thing that we do, where we choose to love someone even when we're not feeling it. And that really is what it means to love something. So when we're taking a look at this, and he says in the same ways, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we're members of his body. He's again drawing this equivalency that we've talked about so many times on this channel of marriage is meant to be a picture of Christ's love for us as his church.
Sure.
And Paul says it here, and he's going to go into more detail with it here in the next couple of verses that we'll study here in a bit. But what he's saying here is that Christ nourishes and cherishes the church because he loves it and chooses to love us as his people. Well, why does he do that? Because as members of his church, we're part of him. So again, this goes back to this idea of, and he's going to say it in verse 31, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. He's just drawing this picture back up that when we marry, we become one. So the idea that we would mistreat, and by mistreat, that means not cherishing and not nourishing our wife.
You're doing that to yourself.
You're doing that to yourself. And he's saying, even like everyone knows that no one hates their own flesh, right? Even if we go to the most extreme example of like suicide, right? People that commit suicide, which from a physical standpoint, I think we would say is it's not possible for you to quote unquote hate your flesh any more than that. From a physical standpoint, I mean, you're bringing your own life to an end. But in those moments leading up to suicide, and we can tell this from notes and testimony of people that tried to commit suicide and failed or whatever, they're doing the thing that their body seems to be driving them to do. And when I say body there, I'm talking about emotionally, mentally, all of that. So even in that moment, they're not hating themselves. They're doing something that they think is going to help them, free them, help those around them, whatever.
Right.
And so even in that extreme example, we're not hating our own flesh in their mindset. Right? So the question then for us as husbands is, how are we treating the part of ourselves that is our wife? Like, are we nourishing and cherishing? And I'm going to talk about each of those words specifically here in a second, but are we nourishing and cherishing our wife as we would nourish and cherish ourselves? And if we're not, what Paul's saying is what you're doing is contrary to nature.
Yeah, and I would say if you struggle with nourishing and cherishing the other part of your relation, not yourself but your spouse, and you, for one reason or another, whatever, especially if that's for selfish reasons, I'm not getting out of this what I think I should be, or this isn't the marriage that I want, or whatever, then kind of flip that on its head and think about it. Well, really, to get out of this marriage what I think I should be, and to get out the goodness, for us to really reach the goodness of marriage, we both need to be investing into the other person.
Right.
Is that selfish? Yeah. I mean, our perspective of pouring into our spouse should not be, well, because I want to get out of it. I want them to then pour into me, or I want out of this marriage good things or whatever, it should be for the good of the other person. But if you really struggle with selfishness or any of those kinds of things, then neglecting your spouse is neglecting yourself.
Right.
And so even if the start of that choosing to nourish and cherish your spouse is out of selfish reasons, then that's the point, though. You're choosing, right?
Right.
And a lot of times our drudgery, the drudgery of nourishing and cherishing our spouse, maybe it's for selfish reasons, turns into a discipline. This just becomes the way of life that I live, and then that can turn into delight.
Right. So if we're gonna think about nourishing and cherishing our wife, we probably ought to know what those terms meant, at least what they meant to Paul. And so I pulled up the Greek in each of these words because this was originally written in Greek by Paul. And so I wanted to take a look at those two words, nourish and cherish, and think about what we can gather from the definition of those words. So the first word, the one that is translated in English as nourish, is ektrepho. And it's a verb. And here's what it means. To bring up to maturity, and they use the English word nourish, which you see this a lot in Greek definitions because so many of those, it's hard to translate them in English or define them in English without using the English word. So I want to focus on that, to bring up to maturity. And this can probably be an awkward thing to think about when we think about husbands with regards to our wives. But our job as a husband is to bring up, to desire spiritual maturity for our wives, to go out of our way sacrificially to come alongside our wives and help bring them up in the maturity of Christ. That is a role for us as husbands. Now, where this can get kind of weird is because it's easy to look at that and go, well, that feels like the guy has been given a preferential role, like a parent role to the wife. And of course, it's not a parental role. I look at it more as a responsibility role, right? So it's easy at your job to look at a responsibility you've been given versus a responsibility someone else has been given and go, well, man, it feels like their job's better than mine. And then at some point you get a chance to do that job and you realize like, oh man, I'm glad that person has to pay is responsible for that role. And in this case, is it that wives are not asked to encourage their husbands to be a better man of God, to follow more? No, I mean, there is a part of that you should desire as a wife because your husband is a part of you as one. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to who's going to be asked, hey, the spiritual temperature of your family, what was it? The husband is going to be held responsible for that. Yeah. So as husbands, are we intentionally trying to raise the spiritual thermometer of our family? Are we pouring into them? Are we raising spiritual conversations? Are we thinking about things of the Spirit and evaluating, are we As a family, how are we measuring up to this? As a father, how am I measuring up to this? As a wife, how is my wife measuring up to this? And going out of our way to raise the spiritual temperature in our home, which includes calling our wife to deeper levels of intimacy in Christ. And, will that feel hypocritical? Well, yeah, if you're not doing that in your own life. I mean, this isn't in a vacuum, right? I mean, our only job is not to, sit there and be judgmental of our wife and be evaluating everything she does and taking notes so that later when the kids go to bed, I can go line by line over the ways she didn't measure up to Christ today. That's a surefire way for disaster. But we ought be evaluating our own lives as husbands before the Lord and evaluating the rest of our family, not in a desire to be judgmental, but in a desire to present our family to Christ as something worthy of the gospel of Christ. And that's our responsibility as husbands. So as we think about nurturing our wives, the question is, are we bringing them up tenderly, lovingly? Because remember, the whole context of this conversation is unconditional love, right? Agape love. That's from the very beginning. Husbands, love agape. Love your wives as Christ loved the church. Husbands, love agape your wives as your own body. And that agape is sacrificial, perfect love. So for us, are we calling our wives to deeper levels, to deeper relationship with Christ in a way that's loving, or are we doing it in a way that's judgmental? Are we doing it in a way that is clear to them, man, we desire the deeper things of Christ for them because Christ is their daddy, is their father, is their one true love even above us, because I'll let Andrea down. So in a sense, me pointing her to Christ is preservation in a sense of, look, I'm going to screw up, but Christ will never let you down. And I desire that more even than relationship with me, that you have relationship with him. And that as I create an environment where she can be nourished in that way, I'm loving, in a sense, my own body, because Andrea is an extension of my body as my wife.
Right. That's the two becoming one flesh part.
Right. So practically, then what does it look like? It's easy to read a verse like this and think, well, what I need to do is tell her about these things that she's doing that aren't God-honoring, that she probably knows aren't God-honoring, and I got to make her do this stuff. Well, sometimes you just have to have those conversations where there's just something going on that's sinful, and we need to, as a sacrifice to the righteousness of Christ, we need as husbands to have an awkward, uncomfortable conversation where we just say, hey, this thing's wrong and it needs to stop. And there are loving, humble ways to do that, but sometimes that's the blunt of it. Is this thing's going on, it needs to stop. And more often, though, I think we as the husbands oftentimes create the environment of our home, or have us play a significant role in that. And so the bigger piece for us is, are we creating an environment that is conducive for our wife to cling closer to the Lord, right? Are we as husbands allowing impure, sinful things into our home outside of our wives that are detracting from the clear sort of line between them and the Lord? Are we sacrificing like we ought to be, right? I mean, are we? I over the years have seen situations where there were women's Bible studies, and there were women that desired to be a part of those Bible studies, but their husbands were resistant to being at home alone with the kids while she went to do that. And I'm talking about, evenings or non-work times, right? But I'll come back to that. But point is that in that situation, I'm not judging anyone in particular, but in that situation, the husband, if what they're saying is true, was a direct detriment to their wife being nourished in their faith, being grown up in their faith, as opposed to maybe taking the other side and going, hey, babe, there's so many things as a woman that you deal with that I can't relate to because I'm not a woman. So what can we do so that you free up to have time to get into deeper relationship with the Lord? And maybe that means making sacrifices monetarily. Maybe there's, something like, what's the Bible study you do?
Community Bible study.
Community Bible study. Maybe it's a financial thing where like, hey, we need to sow financially into you being able to be a part of this so that you can grow. There's childcare there so that you're it's during the day. It's not taking away from our family time because that's important to us because we have so little of it anyway. But we're paying for you to be able to be a part of this thing. And you love it and it's great and you grow a ton spiritually in that. Maybe it's in time, right? I'll come home from work from this time to this time once a week so you can go be a part of a women's Bible study, or I'll stay at home with the kids this night so that you can go be a part of this Bible study. Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just saying, hey, we need to get serious about finding a church that we can get plugged into so that we're not isolating our marriage and our family from the community of Christ.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe you're listening to this and it's as simple as, hey, there's something going on in our relationship right now that is not God honoring. We're living together and we're not married. We're sexually active and we're not married. Maybe it's as simple as you as the future husband, if you're unmarried, going to your future spouse and saying, I'm wrong in the way that I've been leading this and it needs to stop because I want to show you prior to being married that I know how to nourish you. I know how to lift you up before an almighty God. And this thing I'm doing is a detriment to that. And I'm sorry. Right? Maybe there are things going on within your home that are sinful things, impure things, pornography, infidelity, those kinds of things that you need to go to your spouse and say, hey, even if your spouse is okay with that, the fact that the Lord's not okay with it means it's wrong. And it may be just outside of the understanding of your spouse as to why these things aren't okay, but they're not biblically. And so if you want to nourish your spouse and provide and lift her up before an almighty God, you need to come to a place where you go, man, I'm wrong in the way that I'm leading my home in this particular area. Will you forgive me? And just even that humility may be the key to unlocking an opportunity to nourish your spouse further as a part of your own body.
Yep.
Because I guarantee you, if there's something going on within your body that's impure and it's affecting you, you figure it out. Because we want to take care of our bodies. And in this case, our wife is an extension of our body and we need to care for her and nourish her.
There could be some in ways of, nourishing your spouse's relationship with the Lord. There could be things that aren't sinful. And Nathan was talking about some of the practical, but maybe that aren't sinful, but that are not right for your relationship. Maybe you guys watch TV until midnight and then you're too tired in the morning to get up and do Bible study.
That's good.
And so
that's
one of you
call.
needs to say, hey, this isn't right. We need to turn the TV off at whatever time so that we can get up and do a Bible study. Or instead of watching TV, we need to do our Bible study at night or whatever. Or, with kids, one of you, maybe every other day, you say, hey, every other day, one of us is going to get up with the kids and the other one can do their study with the Lord. And then it flips the next day. And, there's things that may be going on that are wrong for everyone, but maybe they're just wrong in your season of life because they detract from nourishing your relationships with the Lord and nourishing your relationship with each other.
Yeah. Or maybe there are things that, as you know your wife, this is why we're told to be students of our spouse, right? Live with our spouse with understanding.
Yep.
That there may be things you know to be true about your spouse that maybe she doesn't know to be true about herself, and you need to intervene on those things. And I'm thinking, as I mention this, things like social media, which can be sometimes more of a temptation for for women to buy into the I don't measure up, everyone else's home is bigger than mine, looks more picked up than mine, all these women on Facebook and etc. are prettier than I am. That maybe it's that your spouse is starting to go down a destructive path because of the amount of time that's being spent thinking about social media or on social media. And you need to step in and just say, hey, I think that this is starting to allow you to buy into some things that aren't true, and we probably need to take a break from that. It might be a difficult conversation because she might not even see it, but that's a way that we can remove from our spouse something that's blocking them from growth in the Lord. That nourishment that they need from the Lord is being stifled by something else going on, right? And you know, again, guys, if you're going, man, it's really difficult for me to think about how I would do that, doesn't seem condemning. Think about making it something that you do together, right? Like, hey, when we're at home, let's get a box by the door and let's buy an outlet and let's put our phone, plug them in and put them in the box. And when we're at home, that's where they stay. And if we get a phone call, you go answer it, obviously, but it stays there wherever it is, whatever that spot is in your house. Maybe have a room, a not comfortable room, the storage room, where you put your stuff in and, hey, if we need to make a phone call, you stay in this room. And, just there are practical things that we can do. But the point is, men, husbands, we need to take an active role in figuring out how do we protect and provide for the spiritual nourishment of our wives. That's nourishment. The second word is cherish. This word cherish, thalpo, is the Greek word.
Thalpo?
Thalpo, yes. No, thalpo.
Like THALPO.
Right. And it means to cherish with tender love. So that to foster with tender love. And then the other definition, which I just love, is to warm or to keep warm. And I thought, man, how many people, and this is me included, if people were to be able to watch through cameras in my home at how I treat you, how many of you would say, man, he feels warm or he feels cold? And I think that really was what I keyed in on as I was thinking about this idea of cherishing. Husbands, are we warm and inviting? Are we fostering our wives with tender love? Or are we fostering them with cold sarcasm? Right? And I know, particularly here in the United States, in the day and age in which we live, like everyone's favorite love language is sarcasm these days. But man, it can be so destructive in our marriages, particularly when husbands use it excessively with regards to their wives, without a significant underpinning of
healthy relationship,
tender lovingness and warmth underneath, right? It's one thing if you have a really tender, loving, warm relationship, but occasionally you give her a hard time about this dish she burned 6 years ago, right? I mean, that's one thing. But it's another thing when the primary way you deal with your spouse is by being sarcastic, which a friend of mine described as stabbing someone with a knife through a pillow. Right? It's like we're giving something biting, which hurts, but it's in the context of joking, which should be funny. And so it's sort of this awkward, like, I just said something kind of offensive to you, but you can't really get mad at me because I said it through a pillow. It's kind of like that, I think it's Talladega Nights with Will Ferrell, where he keeps saying no offense after saying something that's super offensive. And people are like,
What do you
you
mean, no
can't do
offense?
that. And he's like, no, it's in the Geneva Convention. Like, you can't say something really offensive and then say no offense and then expect that there's not a consequence to that. But that's sort of how sarcasm is. And we've kind of accepted that. Like, sarcasm can be a difficult thing to respond to because it's like saying no offense after saying something really offensive. You're like, well, I feel like I want to respond to you saying something mean and sarcastic to me, but I know if I do, you're just going to go lighten up. I'm just being sarcastic. But it's hurtful.
Yeah.
And it's not warm and tender. And so the challenge, men, for you is be honest with yourselves about, am I tender to my spouse? And ask them, like, am I tender to you? And when am I and when am I not?
This is sort of, I think, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. It feels like men have a hard time being warm and tender, not because it's not a part of you, but because that's not what the world thinks you should be.
Right.
And this goes back to what we've talked about before in being naked and unashamed with your spouse. This is a part of you that you don't want to show the world. I mean, it's not like you need to or want to be warm and tender with the world. Sure, there are situations where you may need to be, but this is probably a side of you, men, that you can be completely naked and unashamed with your wife in this area, because she should be protecting your heart, and she should, wives, this is not the word I'm looking for, but kind of stroke that out of you. I mean, she should be where the soft place for your warm and tenderness to land.
Right.
And she should be the one that you want to show that to. And then
Right.
not going, then you should have no fear of her going around and kind of exposing that to other people. That's for her.
Yeah.
And so this goes to being naked and unashamed as a person in front of her, and
Right.
showing her your warmth and your tenderness that you wouldn't show the world, but that she needs.
Right. This kind of goes into a super destructive pattern we've seen in a lot of relationships. And that's where he looks at her as one of the guys and she goes out of her way to try and be one of the guys. Yeah. That's not her role. It's not who she should be in your life. And it's for darn sure not how you should treat her. Like, we're called to male relationships for a reason, and there's also a reason that God doesn't desire men to marry other men. Like, we're meant to be drawn to and to nurture and cherish our wives. She's not one of the fellas. Now, that's great that, maybe what attracts her to you is that you guys have fun together. I'm not saying you shouldn't have fun together. I'm saying there are ways you can treat your guy buddies that you absolutely should never treat your wife. And in this area of cherishing, I think, is one of those. Right? We should, as guys, we have the bro code, right? The honor code that we relate to each other in. You don't have that with your wife. It is unashamed, unfiltered, loving tenderness. That's what we're called to. Mm-hmm. And that's what Jesus showed us when he was on earth. And a lot of us know that because we can watch shows, or we've had bosses in the past where we're like, man, that guy was just a nice guy. Like, I just loved being around him because he was just so nice. Right? We're drawn to that, but then all of a sudden when it's us, it's like, well, I'm going to be a, stony-faced, hardcore dude. And it's like, well, okay, but that's not really who Jesus was. It's not really who we're called to be. And it for darn sure is not how we're called to treat our wife. And so, when we go down that road, again, what Paul's saying here is it's contrary to nature. It's contrary to our calling, and there's going to be consequences to that. So I want you to think about it this way. Like, look, do I have to treat my spouse this way? I haven't for a long time. Should I start? Yes. Why? Because Paul's saying if you don't, there will be trouble for you. Why? Because I'm being disobedient? No, because our marriages are designed to be a picture of Christ's desired relationship with us, and Christ is cherishing and nurturing. to us as his people. Therefore, you as the picture of Christ in your marriage are called and demanded to be cherishing and nurturing to your wife. Because she was designed to receive love that way. Maybe she does a really good job of faking that she doesn't need that, but she does. And sooner or later, if you ignore that, there's going to be trouble for you in your marriage. It's like going up to your roof, taking a running start and jumping off, right? If I took a picture of that with a phone and played it in slow motion, depending on how slow motion I played it, it might look like you achieved flight for a long time. But at the end of that, gravity took over. Because gravity doesn't care what you think about flying. Gravity doesn't care whether you believe in it or don't believe in it. Gravity just is. So at some point at the end of your leap, you fell. And that fell probably hurt when you hit the ground. That's the reality of marriage and the calling husbands have with regards to our wives. You might be able to avoid it for a while, but at some point, it's going to come crashing down. So let's avoid it up front by loving our wives the way we love our own bodies, by nourishing them, by calling them to deeper relationship with the Lord, by sacrificing so that they can have that, and by creating an environment in our marriage of warmth and tender, loving care, so that our wives walk away feeling like we're a picture of Christ in their lives.
Good stuff, Nathan.
Anything else
Thanks.
to add, babe?
Nothing.
All right, a little bit longer episode today. Sorry about that. Got on the soapbox, but appreciate you guys sticking it through with us. If you have any comments, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comments section below. Also, need to start mentioning that we do have a website now, so you can check this episode out there. You can leave comments right there in our website.
Several years in the process.
And that website is www.marriagebydesign.podbean.com. So marriagebydesign.podbean.com. Love to have you follow us there. Check us out. Leave comments there if you'd like, and follow us there as well. Until then, guys, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate you being here. And remember, God is for your marriage. Have a great day.